Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Because what I want to do is I want to talk to here. I don't know. If I look at the camera, it's weird. Flip the viewfinder around. Yep. Don't get your grubby little paws on it. Just take it on the sides and flip it towards me. Towards me so I can see. It flips all the way around. Cool. I like it.
Is it upside down?
No, it's perfect. No, I like the monitor right there, so we kind of got like a border. Is that cool?
Mm-hmm.
Like my Chicago Bears with Decatur behind me.
Woo!
Yay!
Old Decatur.
Old Decatur, not
New Decatur.
not new Decatur. All right. Ryan, do you want to hang around for this whole thing or what?
You probably will.
Okay. It's got to load up. Now I got to enable the audio track.
Audio track.
Audio track.
Audio track.
Audio track.
Audio track. Remember, if you make a mistake, blame it on John.
John. All right. Last spring, I went down to the Shiloh battlefield in Tennessee, and I was able to get a lot of great footage of the battlefield, and pretty much it was a wonderful trip. I was able to walk around the battlefield, and it's a beautiful place down there. There's so much wildlife, and it's hard to believe that, you know, such a terrible thing. You don't move the camera when I'm doing that. Okay, you got the perfect shot there. Let's bring it down. Bring it down. Like, there you go. Perfect. Perfect. All right. And remember, can we tilt it so we have the glow on the border here? I just want a little glow. Stop. Stop. Go back. There you go. Ooh. A little bit more. A little bit more. There you go. Outstanding. Great. Are we going to leave that in the edit, you think? Kids would like that?
No.
No, I don't think the kids would like us.
Just arguing about.
Not arguing. We're solving problems is what we're doing, Ryan. It's a mess, and every time you do it, the workspace changes, and it doesn't allow you to do anything. And why wasn't my audio working?
Hi.
Maybe that was the ticket. I don't know. Does your daddy like computers?
Not really.
Not really. I don't mind computers, I guess. I've always respected them, and I've found them useful. So we're transitioning across the highways. You know, today in America, it's hard to imagine going to war against people down, you know, south of you, north of you, east of you, whatever. Pretty much everywhere you go in the United States, it looks pretty much the same, right, Ryan? I mean, there's differences in geography. We've traveled to Florida before. You remember how different Florida was?
Yes.
How it was a lot hotter and more humid, and it was cool to see the swamps and all that, right? Get your fingers out of your mouth because you're on TV. You're on TV.
I'm scratching my nose.
Well, then don't scratch your nose on TV. And
Don't
get out of my
listen to me.
frame, man. Get out of my frame. So anyways, that attack on Richmond, right? That attack fails. But the rest of the war is pretty much in play. Remember, the Anaconda Plan that General Scott came up with, Winfield Scott, was to cut the Confederacy in two, so to move down the Mississippi River. But then the other thing here is Tennessee. Tennessee's the center point to pretty much the entire game board, right? If we think about the United States being, you know,
Assimilation.
a simulation, right? But it's not a simulation. These are people's lives. This is going to take a lot of resources. And that army starts to gather, at least the Union Army in the West, what's going to basically be known as the Army of the Tennessee. They're going to start gathering in Cairo, Illinois. And Cairo is at the southern tip of Illinois, where the Ohio meets the Mississippi River. And so going through Cairo, you really get a sense that, you know, there's some water around there somewhere. These are the big floodgates that basically protect the town when the river level rises. So it's pretty interesting. Now the industry down there obviously looks like Cairo's seen better days, right? But it still gets a lot of river traffic. In fact, skipping through all this urban blight, which, yep, that's what it looks like. Right over the middle of this picture, you see those?
Mhm.
What are those?
Boats.
Boats, barges along the Ohio River. Those guys are all lined up there. And as you're driving through there, you know, it doesn't take much imagination to imagine where the Union Army would have been gathering its supplies there. This is what Cairo looked like there in 1861.
It looks a lot better.
Well, it's growing at that time, man. Everything's moving. There's all sorts of stuff being built. It's a large city. You've got the river boats all along the way here, moving supplies in and out. And this is where General Grant is going to rise to command the Army of the Tennessee. General Grant was a West Point graduate. He'd served really without distinction in the Mexican-American War. He got involved in some bad dealings and basically resigned from the Army, and almost, you know, was basically, I wouldn't say poverty, but he got into a business with his wife's family there in Galena, Illinois.
Galena.
Which is pretty. We've never been to Galena, Ryan. We need to go. It's in the northwest corner, the highest elevation in Illinois. I forgot how many feet it is there, but it's really pretty in the fall. But anyways, he worked his way down from Illinois and wound up using some of his old Army contacts to gain command of some Union forces there. And they'd basically done a pretty good job of fortifying Cairo, and they were in the process of building ships. Many of these ships are later going to become ironclads, and we'll have a whole nother discussion on
Those
that
are stupid.
in our next... Stupid?
They suck because the battles will go on forever.
Well, that's how it works, so then what do they need to do?
I don't know.
Well, what's the solution there?
To make them weaker.
Well, how do you make them weaker?
Not use metal.
Okay, but everybody's going to use iron, and then we're going to make steel because steel is tougher than iron. So what are we going to need to build more of in order to sink them?
Ironclad ships.
Well, we're going to need to build bigger what?
Ironclad.
What's going to sink them? Bigger what?
Cannons.
Bigger guns, right? And then you're going to get into armor-penetrating rounds, and we come up with all sorts of ingenious ways to kill each other. It's pretty amazing, really. Well, the idea is that there's going to be a fight that the Navy's going to be working on there down the Mississippi River, moving south there from New Madrid. It looks like New Madrid. And
New Madrid.
New Madrid. There are going to be a few little strings of successes here that Grant's going to have over on Kentucky. Remember, Kentucky's a border state. Over here in Kentucky, you've got the confluence of the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River. The Cumberland River is sort of one of those things that winds up being a sideshow. But the Cumberland, look how it runs parallel to the Tennessee, so that means you can move forces down the Cumberland and you can move forces down the Tennessee River, and they can work together. So up here in the cold winter months and spring months of 1862, Grant is going to send his command basically up the Tennessee River, and by up we mean they're heading south. Their targets are going to be these Confederate forts here held just on the border inside of Tennessee called Forts Henry and Fort Donaldson. The Union Army is going to utilize its gunboats. There's going to be some pretty effective bombardments of these structures. These forts are really, I wouldn't say they were poorly constructed, but they're right along the river. They're subject to being flooded all the time. The Union can pretty much sail up to these things and pound away at them. Grant is going to enter into kind of, surrender negotiations with the Confederates, who realize that there's really no way for them to win this battle. The Confederates want to have some conditions, like can we keep our firearms, or can we be released after a certain amount of time? And Grant basically refuses to negotiate any of this and says the only surrender I will accept is unconditional surrender. Well, the newspapers grab a hold of this, and if we think about, Ulysses Simpson Grant, the newspapers start to call U.S. grant, unconditional surrender grant. So his reputation is starting to climb here, really, in the newspapers and with the Army of the Tennessee itself. Well, we can see in this map here, taken from the Ken Burns Civil War special. Ryan, you see all the blue lines up here moving in. Yeah. Forts Henry, Forts Donaldson, pretty much the entire area of the Cumberland River. That's just across the, see how it runs basically over to Nashville. The Tennessee River basically goes into the heart, right into the middle of Tennessee. And what you can basically see here is a place what does that say, Ryan? What's that called?
Pittsburgh Landing.
Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. And right down here, just south of the Tennessee River and Pittsburgh Landing is a place called what?
Cadora.
Look at the word. Corinth. Say it. Corinth.
Corinth.
Corinth. Louder.
Corinth.
Corinth. Corinth is a old Greek name. A lot of Greek stuff. What, Abby? You want to come be in my video real quick? Ryan, why don't you get in here? It's closer. If you're going to be in a video, Ryan, you can't put your fingers in your mouth. And we got to keep moving here. I don't want to spend the whole day editing this. Hi.
Hi.
Come around here so we can see you beautiful children. What were you yelling about up there earlier? Is Piper one in the shot too? No, I don't think we can fit her in here. So what were you yelling about earlier, Abby?
Nothing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, right. She's laughing.
No, I'm
okay.
not.
Well, we're going to get on with our lesson here. We're talking about the Civil War, talking about the Battle of Shiloh. Down here, what's this called, Ryan?
Pittsburgh Landing.
And then what's this town called?
Corinth.
Corinth. Good. Look, Abby. So yeah, Corinth. Why do they want Corinth? Why does the Union want Corinth? Well, if we go back to that idea of railroads, we got to remember that there aren't very many railroads that the South has that go east to west. Corinth is going to be a rail intersection for two railroads. They're going to have a junction there in Corinth. So Corinth is only about 20 miles away from Pittsburgh Landing. So the Union Army is going to land there, this place called Shiloh, in March of 1862. And what's taking place is that, well, on my trip down to the battlefield of Shiloh, I made sure that I stopped by Corinth to really grab a pretty close look at the place. Corinth is a pretty well documented historical place. The Confederacy was using the railroad junction as a supply depot, so they were able to move men and equipment in and out of that area of operations. And so if you capture Corinth, you pretty much are able to control everything all the way around the area. So Corinth had this hotel, and this hotel is long gone. But this is going to figure pretty prominently in a lot of the paintings and a lot of the action that takes place around there. So the Union Army is digging in Shiloh. And Shiloh is, like we said, 20 miles away.
You shot a cannon.
Corinth... That'd be pretty cool if they let people shoot the Parrott rifle there. This is a Union Parrott rifle. These were pretty cool. This is sort of the high-tech gun of the era. This thing fires a huge shell. You can see inside the barrel that it's rifled, so that shell spins as it's fired. And these things are really, really accurate. And I don't want to get too much. I don't want to get bogged down in the technical details of a lot of this. But the city of Corinth has a really awesome local history museum, and the museum has a lot of stuff from Corinth's past. There's this really neat little model railroad showing the hotel position and where the tracks are going in this junction. This model railroad is situated in a way that you're able to actually look out the window of the depot where this museum is and visualize where things are headed. So basically we're looking towards Memphis on our upper right, and then taking further down the Gulf of Mexico into Mississippi there on our left.
Gulf of Mexico? Oh.
Thank you, Ryan. So Railroads, remember what we said about railroads. Railroads are like time machines. Generally, when a company buys the property on which to build a railroad, they're never going to sell that property back, and so the railroads are going to basically stay in that location. So it is pretty cool, like I said, to look out the window there and get a view of where you are. So we'll come back to the Corinth Museum later, but don't be careful with that coffee, would you please? We'll come back to the Corinth Museum later. There, in early April of 1862, Grant is going to be camped out in southern Tennessee around Pittsburgh Landing. His forces are going to be, I don't want to say spread out, but he's basically waiting to meet up with this other Union commander, a guy by the name of Buell. So Buell had been over there in Nashville through Franklin in Columbus, Tennessee. Now he's working his way west back to join Grant here along the Tennessee River. So Grant's basically in a holding pattern. The Confederate Army under General Johnson has gathered around Corinth, and he takes his army north to fight against Grant. This is going to basically start around April 4th and April 5th of 1862. The Confederates are marching through an area that's pretty rugged in terms of its terrain. It's not very flat. In fact, it's pretty hilly. The roads are not going to be very well constructed, and it's been raining, so they're muddy. The army is going to get strung out. As an army marches, it's really hard to imagine us in the 21st century, what it means to put tens of thousands of men up trails, like the kind of trails that you'd see there in Allerton Park or Lodge Park or wherever. So you're going to have these really muddy roads. It's going to slow things down. The Union Army has plenty of warning with their patrols and whatnot that there's Confederates that are out there lurking in the woods. Grant's going to be nearby up at a place called Savannah. I don't want to get really bogged down in the specifics of this battle, but let's basically understand that the Union Army is not very well prepared for what is coming. Hey, I gotta look at my script, man.
Yeah.
Wait, you have a script?
Yes. To read. That's what he has it for.
We're gonna edit this part out.
We're gonna edit a lot of stuff out, man. This is...
Even me smelling Abby's hair?
Yeah.
You did that?
Yes.
Don't pull my hair. Please don't.
I smelled it.
Stop it.
Now let's get into the real business again. Let's get into the real business again. Like actually talking, not actually just like joking around.
I know, right? When I was at Shiloh, I went out and started basically right here. And this would have been a lot light. It would have been a lot darker there in 1862. But about 4 o'clock in the morning, the Confederates are going to start attacking basically towards us. And this, kind of looking. What we're doing here is we're looking west and south. So all across this pasture, there would have been fighting between Confederate and Union forces. Well, as soon as that fighting breaks out, the Union Army basically comes alive. But you have to remember, everybody here's an amateur. This is going to be the first time any of these guys, both Confederate or Union, have been in combat before. So commands are going to be pretty confused. Everybody's going to be, unaware of what's happening, simply because if you look at the terrain, you got so many hills and the area is so heavily forested, you lose a sense of perspective pretty quickly in there. You can imagine, you've got a lot of old growth forests. This area became a national military park very shortly after the Civil War as part of that sort of historical preservation movement that took hold there in the 1880s and 1890s. Moving up this road, we're looking towards the Union position, so the Confederates would have been moving up this road here, up this trail. Basically, the Union is starting to come to its senses that this is a really big Confederate assault. This isn't just a patrol. This isn't just a small skirmish. This is, in fact, the entire Confederate Army. The Confederates are under the command of a guy by the name of General Johnston, and Johnston's command is basically working to push the Union Army up against the Tennessee River. If they can smash the Union Army up against the Tennessee, then there's really not any place for them to go. Well, let's go ahead and take a look here at the military park. This is pretty cool statues. Like I said, lots of monuments, and it's really interesting to see when all this stuff is going to be built. Are you leaving me, Ryan? Peace out. Okay, good to go, man.
I think I'm gonna leave.
You're gonna leave too? You're not gonna look at the pretty pictures with me?
You can show me later.
Well, you can stay right here. It's kind of cool to do this video when I'm like talking to somebody. You know.
Well, you are.
Well, I'm talking to you. Come here. Are you gonna leave me too? My whole family's abandoning me.
I'm sorry.
What can you do? All right. My basic plan for shooting Shiloh was to start where the action began there about 4 o'clock in the morning, and then basically drive backwards towards Pittsburgh Landing and the whole position there. But the thing that I want us to kind of look at is the natural beauty of Shiloh. The best way that I can describe Shiloh to Monticello people is basically imagine Allerton Park with a lot more cannons and statues of soldiers. But it's a very beautiful place, a lot of natural wonder, and I could have just basically stayed around the brooks and the springs and the fields with the flowers and all that. It would have been just amazing. Another reason why there's so much Civil War literature and history and just all kinds of stuff out there, you know, that's still being written to this day, is because the armies that fought in the Civil War were very, very literate. These guys are all going to write down their observations and their memories of the war, if they've survived the battle, and a lot of them will mention that, you know, during this time, you know, these northern boys are, you know, we think about April, we just got done with some pretty cold, wintry feeling days here, and now we're obviously it's getting a lot warmer now. But down there in April in Tennessee, it feels like May in Illinois, and the flowers are in the trees, and there are birds, and, you know, spring has sprung, and in the middle of this just hellacious fighting that's taking place, there's this remarkable wonder with the smells and colors of nature. So as you go there, it's kind of hard to miss that, really. So we've crossed that creek, and we're now looking onto the Confederates. So the Confederates would be basically working their way down that hill, over that creek, and up this hill towards our position. The Union's going to be basically fighting what's called a delaying action, and that's basically the idea that, you know, we're out in front, we know we're going to be overrun, we have to leave ourselves a way to get out, but we still have to offer a ton of resistance, or at least as much resistance as they can. Alright, so this video here gives us a sense of what soldiers are trying to do. The weapons are a lot more accurate now than what they would have been even in the Mexican-American War. These are now going to be kind of like bullets. Well, they are bullets, but we're not dealing with musket ball anymore. The Union would have been using these weapons a lot more than the Confederates. In fact, many of the Confederate soldiers there at the Battle of Shiloh are still carrying, you know, hunting rifles and even a few smoothbore muskets that they would have carried there during the Mexican-American War. What I like about this reenactment video is they do a really nice job of making sure that the soldiers look accurate. You know, they're not middle-aged, overweight guys. Nothing against overweight, middle-aged guys, but it's kind of cool to see this done in a way that looks very, very real.
Order! Arms! No position was as important as load in 9 times. The loading drill taught not only the steps in loading the musket, but for the officers established a standard rate of fire for his men and his company. The drill would begin with the order.
Load in 9 times. Load.
The musket brought to the center of the feet in a snug but convenient location to handle the rammer and to place eyes on the muzzle. Hand to his cartridge box, which held the 40 hand-rolled paper rounds. With a cartridge between the thumb and pointer finger, place the cartridge to the mouth, using teeth to open the powder end of the cartridge. Bullet to the front of the muzzle. Dumping the gunpowder down the barrel, then squeezing the bullet into the muzzle.
Draw rammer.
Placing the tulip or head of the rammer upon the point of the bullet.
Ram cartridge. Return rammer.
In battle, many nervous soldiers would forget this and would shoot their rammers at the rebels.
Prime.
The musket is now eased in front of the soldier, muzzle down range at the height of the eye.
Shoulder. Arms.
In battle, every man was supposed to finish the loading process in 15 to 20 seconds. By the book, every man could shoot 3 rounds per minute. Each company of 90 muskets could fire 270 rounds per minute. Every regiment of 10 companies could fire 2,700 rounds per minute. By the Middle War period, the average strength of a regiment in the Army of the Potomac was 400 men. Firing 3 rounds per minute, a veteran regiment could easily expend 12,000 rounds in a 10-minute firefight.
So the amount of firepower that's going on in this battlefield is pretty devastating. These are large numbers. The Confederate Army numbers about 40,000, and the Union Army is going to number eventually about 51,000. The Confederates are in a race against the clock. The Confederates are trying to push hard through the forests there, getting closer and closer. The Union Army was encamped around a place called Shiloh Church. Yeah, there's the Shiloh Church. Like I said, it was Sunday. They were having services, so got the Methodists there. But this place would have basically been the one of the forward Union camps, and this is where you're going to have a lot of information coming in and out of. You're going to have, you know, a lot of reports, and everybody's trying to figure out what in the heck's going on. Back to that idea, this is a pretty cool diorama. You can just kind of imagine it's hard to imagine, I think, the smoke and chaos that's going on, you know, inside of this battlefield. But pretty cool sense of scale all the way around it. So you've got these hilly forests, but there is, to the right of the frame, you saw a field. That's kind of how the Battle of Shiloh is going to be fought. You're going to have these, you know, really rugged timbers with, you know, sort of ravines and small creeks, and then you're going to come up to a place that a farmer has, you know, carved out. There's going to be this place called the Peach Orchard that is, you know, going to be in bloom during this battle. There are going to be a lot of various places and locations that are going to earn nicknames there. So we can see the Shiloh Church. This is from that Bruce Catton's Civil War. These really kind of cool bird's eye views of the battlefield. That's Shiloh Church, and you can see the Confederates are pressing pretty hard. You've got the Purdy Road, the Western Corinth Road, and then the Confederates just keep, you know, surging across. But down here in the bottom right, you're going to see this thing called the Sunken Road. And behind the sunken road, you're going to have what becomes known as the Hornets Nest. This is where a Union commander, a guy by the name of Prentice, is going to gather some boys from Iowa, some people from Illinois, some guys from Wisconsin too. I think these are all Midwestern Union forces. They're going to hold off the Confederates for multiple hours. In fact, there at the Hornets Nest, Prentice is basically buying time for Grant to get the rest of the Union Army up there, situated around Pittsburgh Landing, to respond to this Confederate attack. So the fighting of the Hornets Nest, and then you see down below there's a place called Bloody Pond, and taking video of all that was a pretty interesting experience and pretty awesome place to go. Junction Road, looking over at the Confederate positions. The Confederates would have had to cross this field, and then the Union positions would be back over into the trees there. That's where the Hornets Nest was located. And lots of various memorials and whatnot. This is the Bloody Pond, and the Bloody Pond is actually south of what's called the Peach Orchard. According to the, I don't want to say folklore, according to the written records of the battle, soldiers from the Union and the Confederacy, wounded men, are going to come over to this pond to get a drink, because you have to imagine they've been fighting all day long, and the many soldiers are going to describe the sensation of thirst as being terribly overwhelming, and you can just imagine, physical exertion combined with all the mental energy and even just the process of loading the gun. I mean, they're still taking that paper cartridge into their mouth and tearing it open and then going through the motions of loading their rifles. So it's going to be a pretty intensive process. But the Bloody Pond is called the Bloody Pond because it was red by the end of the day. There's all sorts of really cool stuff about the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh is going to live long in the memory. There's going to be a lot of photographs that are taken. This is the Peach Orchard. Basically, this position right here with the fence out in front, that's going to be this position right here. So we've got the Confederate lines over there on the other side of the cannons. So those would have been a Union battery there. And the cannons, remember, they're working pretty much the same way as the rifles are. They're going to be firing, just all kinds of shells and artillery against the Confederates. And the Confederates are going to be trying to do that as well. You're going to have trees just being knocked down and splinters of wood. I mean, you think about during this battle, not only do you have to worry about lead flying your way, but when the lead hits the trees, you're going to have just massive splinters flying through the air, causing all kinds of chaos. So the Union soldiers there, under the command of Prentice, they're in the Hornets Nest, which lives long in the memory, pretty much center of the battlefield there. In fact, there's the meandering path on the right led to the Hornets Nest, where the Union troops under Brigadier General Benjamin M. Prentice held out for 6 hours, withstanding a dozen rebel assaults and point-blank artillery fire before surrendering, and thereby turned near certain defeat into a standoff. "Captain, give me a gun," shouted a wounded Union soldier who had returned to the fighting after being ordered to the rear. "This darn fight ain't got any rear." The Union, in many ways, is panicking. A lot is going to be said about the chaos that's taking place there on the first day of the battle, April 6th, 1862. Grant is going to arrive at Pittsburgh Landing, and he is going to very quickly take charge of the situation. However, with him is going to be a newspaper journalist who's going to later help sort of formulate this myth that General Grant had been drunk on the day of the battle. Well, what we know about General Grant is he's a pretty rough and tumble character when it comes to taking charge. His men believe in him. He has pretty good control over the situation. He is a great right-hand man, a guy by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman, who will one day rise to command the Army of the Tennessee that Grant's dealing with here. But Grant has this coolness under fire, as you can see dramatically interpreted in this lithograph. This would have been something that would have appeared in newspapers there. But Grant, throughout pretty much the entire battle, he's not going to be drinking. He's going to have this cigar that's going to be in various states of, either it's going to be lit or it's going to be unlit. He's going to be chomping on a cigar pretty much all the time. In fact, he's going to smoke a lot of cigars during the Civil War, and that's going to have a pretty detrimental effect to his health down the road. Besides getting held up by the Union there at the Hornets Nest, the Confederates are really starting to get broken apart in the hills and the forests. They can't maintain communication. The fighting is point blank. I mean, you're talking, guys laying into each other with these rifles, no more than 10, 20, 30 yards away. And the fighting is even hand-to-hand in many cases. General Johnston of the Confederate Army, the commander, he is going to be mortally wounded during the battle. And command of the Confederates is then going to switch over to this guy by the name of Braxton Bragg. After days fighting, General Bragg is going to order the Confederates into their positions for the evening to basically stop fighting, at least for the time being. These guys have been up for over 48 hours. They probably haven't eaten a good meal. Many of them have been wounded. Many of them have seen friends killed. And the Union knows the same situation. But what the Union have been able to do is there's two things. They've sent these two gunboats up the Tennessee River to help out. One called the Tyler and the other's called the Lexington. And so as it gets colder there on Sunday night into Monday morning, and it starts to rain over this battlefield, and you can imagine, the screams of the men that are wounded out there, in all sorts of movement taking place, and then people sleeping whenever they can. The Tyler and the Lexington, these Union gunboats, are going to keep sending artillery rounds into the Confederate camp pretty much all night long. Meanwhile, the Union Army, a guy by the general named Buell, had made his way across down to Savannah, which is just north, Savannah, Tennessee, which is just north of the Shiloh battlefield here. General Buell's got his army coming in as well. The Union under Grant and Sherman, well, they're going to be building a line of guns and men right around Pittsburgh Landing, and it's going to stretch out all along, as you can see from this map here, all the way along, the corner of what's called the Hamburg-Savannah Road. So Sherman's out there, McClernand, these are all going to be guys that are commanding divisions in the Army of the Tennessee. But Grant, over here at Pittsburgh Landing, he's going to be, kind of supervising this first attack that the Confederates are going to make on the second day. On the second day, the Union Army is going to hold off a Confederate attack, and very shortly after this Confederate attack fails, the Union's going to launch what's called a counterattack. And this counterattack is going to push the Confederates pretty much off the battlefield. It's going to be a pretty close thing. To say that the Confederates turned and ran would be an insult to what they fought for there. But you got to understand that as Grant and Buell's army, everybody starts moving forward, it's pretty much an irresistible surge of Union forces there. You have the Ohio, so this would have been a group called Men. There's signage all over the battlefield. But you can see there, this battery of 4 guns was engaged here from 9 a.m. to 12 probably p.m. April 7th, 1862. It then moved to the right 350 yards. So you've got pretty good, accurate information about who was where and doing what during this battle. Yet again, you start to think about the cannons firing into the forest there, and how effective that's going to be, but how also that's going to, those trees are going to catch a lot of lead. So I was making my way around the battlefield. I pulled into this place, and I couldn't tell if it was a museum or some guy's garage, like his personal private collection. But it really wound up being one of the most amazing things of the trip. In this little side road museum, this guy had the largest collection of just Civil War refuse I've ever seen. After the battle, there were battle relics strewn everywhere. Along with these were the bodies of the blue and gray, along with the horses. They were buried as quickly as possible, some with only a few scoops of dirt put upon them. My mother, who was born near where Colonel Peabody was killed, she found relics laying everywhere. Her brother, J.B., found cannonballs in fields he plowed with a mule. He picked them up and stacked them around the tree in the backyard. So, just a really amazing collection of artifacts that this person has in their in basically like a shed. The guy didn't charge me admission or anything. So, assortment of bullets used at Shiloh. So this stuff is basically just Civil War refuse, things that were fired into the ground, trees and everything else, and collected by the people who carried on their lives there. Just like I said, one of the largest collections of these bullets I've ever seen, and really, I thought this guy's collection gave the national the National Park Museum up there a pretty good run for its money. There's great stuff at the National Park Museum too, though. To wrap this whole thing up. And do it in a way that we can kind of get on to what we need to do in 7th grade social studies. Let's understand that Shiloh's significance in all of this isn't just that the Union Army won and drove the Confederates off the field. There's going to be fighting around Corinth throughout the spring and summer of 1862. That's going to be where the Union's going to devote all of its energy. And what we really need to understand about the Battle of Shiloh is that the losses in this battle were utterly appalling. The battle kills more soldiers than all of America's wars combined up to that point. In other words, if we look at the total amount of battle deaths, you have about 1,700 Confederate losses, and then you have about 1,700 Union losses. Hard to imagine that the United States would have only lost, 3,000, less than 4,000 men in all of its wars combined up to that point. But you got to talk about, people dying in battle. The way that they count casualties, also includes this huge number of Confederates. I mean, look at that, over 8,000 casualties. Those are guys that are wounded, guys that are going to be sick, guys that stand a possible chance of dying later. So you've got 8,000 of those guys that are going to be wounded, and about 8,400. So you've got 16,000 people that you have to take care of here. Back to the really cool museum there in Corinth. They did an interesting thing of documenting what women did. So we've got Kate Cumming. Corinth had a variety of dedicated nurses working in its hospitals. One such nurse was Kate Cumming, inspired by Florence Nightingale. That's a British nurse who served in the Crimean War in the 1850s, and Florence Nightingale sort of created modern nursing. So this Kate Cummings, she left her hometown of Mobile, Alabama, and traveled to Corinth, where she nursed the wounded after the Battle of Shiloh. She lacked training but learned quickly. Kate felt strongly that women should volunteer during the war, regardless of social mores that suggested nursing soldiers was not a respectable occupation for refined women. From my experience since last writing on that subject, that a lady's respectability must be at a low ebb when it can be endangered by going into a hospital. This Mary Ann Ball, who was born in Ohio there in 1817, so this means she's about 45 during the Shiloh battle. By the outbreak of the American Civil War, Mary Ann was Mrs. Bickerdike, a widowed mother of 2 young sons, lived in Galesburg, Illinois. When her church sent supplies to Cairo, Illinois for federal soldiers, she went along and was subsequently devoted to the cause. After the Battle of Shiloh, Bickerdike was put in charge of the field hospital at Farmington, Mississippi, and once the Federal Army secured Corinth, she took responsibility over Corona College Hospital. Mother Bickerdike quickly became a favorite among soldiers, for she always saw that their needs were met, whether it be a cold drink of water or a clean dressing. Bickerdike also gained the respect of many Northern generals, including Grant and Sherman. When one lower-ranking officer began to complain about that woman Bickerdike to Sherman, the general heartily replied, "Only God outranks her." This is in the newspaper of Corinth. Like we said, it says the Crossroads Museum collection, so that's going to be where all this stuff is found there in Corinth. Help the wounded. I have just received the following dispatch from Madison. Collect all the sheets, pillowcases, shirts, bandages, and hospital stores by tomorrow noon and send them to Clinton on the noon train. A great and terrible slaughter has occurred at or near Corinth, Mississippi. If not your husband's brothers' sons are the victims, they are your brethren. Send all such supplies by 9 o'clock tomorrow to the Common Council room. The communities are going to respond. The Confederates are obviously going to have their hospitals, and the Union's going to have their hospitals. But care for these 16,000 wounded is going to put a pretty tremendous strain on the medical resources. So, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Shiloh is going to shock everybody. The fact that there were so many men that were killed in this battle, the fighting was so ferocious, that it's just a precursor of what's to come. General Grant and General Sherman, their reputations really are only going to rise to greater heights. Grant is going to catch some flack for his performance there at Shiloh, but under the circumstances, when you think about what was going on, the Confederate plan could arguably have been flawed from the start. But the idea of, there is this mentality that we don't really understand here in 2020, but that it's better to attack than just dig in and wait it out and have a siege. The Confederates are going to make their move because, they know it's only a matter of time before Buell and the rest of these, larger Union forces are able to gather. But the battlefield of Shiloh is definitely worth visiting. I can highly recommend it. It's only about a 6.5 hour drive away. So it took about a day to get down there. Went around the battlefield basically for like an entire day, and then made my way home after that. There above Pittsburgh Landing is the military cemetery for the Union forces there. Although it was an active military cemetery, there's a lot of other veterans and people that are buried there as well. But that was where the bodies were buried for the Union Army there. The Confederates were going to be put into basically mass graves, like pits, and pretty sad when you think about the entire situation and the loss of human life. There at Corinth in the Crossroads Museum, I struck up a conversation with one of the ladies that was a volunteer there. And we had a very pleasant conversation. Of course, she could tell from the accent that I'm a northerner pretty immediately. I have no real personal connection in terms of like that family history that I was talking about with the Civil War. I don't have any of that at the Battle of Shiloh. I mean, that takes place in April of 1862. It's the first major battle of the Civil War in the West, where we are. But I told her a little bit about my great-great-grandfather in the 107th Illinois, and she shared a story about her great-grandfather, and basically she started researching her family's her family's service in the war. They were from Mississippi, so I can't remember if it was her grandpa or her great-grandpa, but beside the point, she said she started reading up on his unit and following where he went, and then he just disappears. There's no record of him after that at all. So he was probably one of the nameless thousands who would have fallen in these battles and would have wound up in a mass grave. The Civil War is like I said, there's so much philosophical stuff going on with the Civil War. You still have to understand that it's a massive tragedy on an epic scale. And to be, teaching you guys about this point in American history while we've got this other thing going on in American history there, it's kind of weird and surreal. This whole time period's been weird and surreal. But the time at Shiloh was very well spent. It's a beautiful area with some really important history. It was really neat to go back and look at the battlefield, having visited it as a second grader back there in the 80s. Look at that hair. Nonetheless, the museum there, this is all stuff from the, these are all artifacts from the National Park Museum there at the Battle of Shiloh. All this stuff is right up around Pittsburgh Landing. Cartridge boxes, you can see the rifling there. They're no longer flintlocks. Remember, they have a cap that causes the ignition of the gunpowder. One of those really large, kind of toothpick-looking dagger Bowie knife sort of things there that seem to be carried by people. This is kind of neat. Colonel Wraith was mortally wounded leading a charge of his Illinois troop near Shiloh Church on April 6th. Colonel Wraith brought this meerschaum pipe from Germany. It was picked up by a Confederate cavalryman on the battlefield and returned to Wraith's grandson. Reportedly, Johnny Clem served as a drummer boy at Shiloh, 10 years of age, one of the youngest participants in the battle. He retired from the Army as a major general. Johnny Clem may have been a drummer at the Battle of Shiloh. That's kind of how the story goes. But there's a lot of evidence that says that maybe he wasn't there, that he was at this other battle called Chickamauga, which we'll talk about later. But drummers played a huge role in communicating orders and commands on the battlefields. But they're really going to get to a point where the days of communicating using music are pretty numbered. Fife and drum really can't be heard over the cannon fire and the rifles and all that. So you get into this idea during the Civil War of actually having really big bands that are going to be playing during the battle. But music still serves that role of communicating orders. And what you see at the Battle of Shiloh is that the Confederates are not going to be able to communicate very well given the terrain and what's going on with their attack. This is some pretty nasty stuff. This is either going to be called grape shot or canister round. This would have been loaded into the cannon, and then it would have basically had a powder charge behind it, and that powder charge would ignite, and all these little lead balls are going to go flying out. So basically turning, we've talked about this a little bit before, turning cannons into shotguns, and they're just going to blast away. This is the Tennessee River and Pittsburgh Landing. This would have just been filled with ships, riverboats, unloading men and materials there during the Battle of Shiloh. So this would have been pretty much, the action central of the entire thing. One that ran the roadside museum there, that had all those really cool, really rough artifacts there from the battle, was talking about the memorials and why so many of the memorials are going to show women in them. The Illinois Memorial there had to go make a trip out to go see it on the battlefield, and everything's pretty clearly labeled. But one of the things that was interesting is that and who knows if this guy was, who knows if there's really a lot of efficacy to this story or whatever, or why I'm even telling it now. But basically, these guys that are living, on the frontier, these boys that are both northern and southern, Dad's not going to be around very much. There's always going to be farming and hunting and chores and work to be done, and a lot of these guys are going to grow up with a really strong, close bond with their mom. And so when these memorials are made, a lot of times, they're going to have a lot of feminine imagery. Memorial there, you've got the imagery of mother holding her fallen son. So just make sure that we answer the questions. I'm going to give you guys a little bit more time to get this done. I'll probably make this due about a week from now. Just try not to fall behind on what we're doing, and I'll try not to fall behind on making these. It was a really tough decision to decide how to go about this. I worked on some stuff that I don't really know if I like how it goes together, and that's more my problem than your problem. Like I said, I lost some stuff last night that I was videoing, and I just didn't like some of the concepts that I was trying to do. We're going to keep it pretty simple on this, but also try to use some of that footage and whatnot. I'm done talking. I've got to edit this. This is going to be horrible to edit.